Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. So, in this lesson, we'll be analyzing the poem London. So, if I'm going to give you an overlook of the poem, so this poem actually describes a walk through London streets, and this London is presented as a wounded, as an oppressive, as an impoverished city in which all the speaker can find is misery. So it places particular emphasis on the sounds of London, with cries from men, women, and children throughout the poem. So this shows that everybody is in a state of misery. The whole city is in a state of misery. The poem is in part a response to, which is very obvious, industrial revolution, but more than anything, it is a critique of human failure to build a society which is based on love, joy, or freedom and communication with God. So in a way, he's trying to suggest that this is a city which is built on the foundation of industrial revolution, and it is without any love, joy, freedom, or without any connection with the God. So with this, we begin with the analysis. I wandered through each charted street near where the charted Thames does flow. So the opening of the poem, it introduces the idea that the reader will follow the speaker as they walk through London and observe what they see and hear. So the word wander makes the walk feel relaxed and almost unplanned. This helps to show that suffering described later is not unusual but part of everyday life in the city. Okay, so at first the reader does not fully realize how unpleasant the city is. Instead, the opening lines only hint at its oppressive nature. Kaise? With the word chartered. So the word chartered changes this feeling of freedom. Okay, so a charter is a legal document that controls or limits access or rights. जैसे कि charter flight होती है ना, तो public के लिए नहीं होती. Okay, so by using this word, the speaker shows their dislike of modern society's restrictions on human life. The phrase "chartered streets" suggests that London is like a cage. It is trapping its people in suffering. The repetition of chartered in line 2 near where the chartered Thames does flow. So this repetition, excuse me. So the repetition of chartered in line 2, which becomes what? A diacope. It emphasizes that this sense of control is everywhere and it is inescapable. यहाँ भी जाओ तो chartered, वहाँ जाओ तो chartered. Okay. So these trees represent not only physical boundaries but also mental ones, which are later described as mind forged manacles. The second line also applies charter to the river Thames. River Thames is a part of nature. The Thames is the river that flows through London and it is an important part of the city. In Blake's time, it was heavily polluted. Okay, so normally rivers symbolize freedom and natural beauty, but here the Thames adds to the sense of decay and restriction. So grammatically, the phrase does flow briefly suggests the phrase does flow, it briefly suggests movement and freedom through its smooth assonance. But then this is quickly interrupted by a full stop. Does flow के बाद थोड़ा सा flow करना चाहिए था, but immediately there came a full stop. So this cuts off any sense of openness or flowing, and it reinforces limitation. So the use of chartered may also allude to Thomas Paine's rights of man, and in that Paine criticizes chartered towns as being controlled by powerful groups, reflecting inequality in society. And we're going to talk about it more in the literary devices section in allusion. Okay. Next two lines, and mark in every phase I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. So lines 3 and 4 show that the speaker beginning to describe what they notice while walking through London. They see a city full of suffering, weakness, and woe. The speaker does not see this in just a few people, but in every face. This suggests that something about London itself forces these conditions onto its people. So, in a way, London में ही कुछ ऐसा है जिसकी वजह से the people become suppressed over there. So, this suggests the conditions, the London itself, it forces itself upon the people. The city feels like a powerful force that ordinary people cannot escape. except perhaps those who are wealthy or in power. देखो चार्टर्ड जो होता है वो ऑब्वियसली इट इज इन कंट्रोल ऑफ वेरी फ्यू पीपल. ओके ना, बाकी सारे पीपल आर नॉट फ्री to access it. So the word mark is important over here. In line 3, it is used as a verb, and mark in every phase. It is used as a verb. Okay ना, meaning notice. Now notice in every phase I meet marks. और इधर क्या बन गया, noun हो गया. In line 4, it becomes a noun describing how people's faces show their suffering. This is new little device for you which is known as antennae. Okay ना. उसके नीचे लिटरेरी डिवाइस के अंदर वी गोइंग टू बी गोइंग थ्रू इट, which is this antennae. Okay, so this is a rhetorical device and type of pun where a word or phrase is repeated within a sentence, but its meaning changes or shifts upon other use. Okay na, suggest, and this Anton classes suggest that everyone is affected by London's oppression. The repetition of mark also creates a sense that speaker is separate from the people being described. The speaker observes their suffering from outside. This implies the speaker may not be part of the poor people they are describing. And if you're going to look at more closely, the metrical shift is present in line 4, which makes this idea even stronger. Marks of weakness, marks of woe. Okay, so before this, the poem uses a steady iambic tetrameter, which feels like a regular walking pace. However, line 4 disrupts this rhythm. It begins with a trochee to emphasize the words marks and to emphasize the word marks, and the line is shorter than usual. There are 7 syllables instead of 8. This sudden change reflects how the suffering of the people interrupts the speaker's steady walk, almost making them stumble as they notice it. Okay, so here it is. So, what is the metrical shift over here? This is the metrical shift. Okay, the first line or in the previous lines are iambic. Okay, unstressed, stress. Then they have become trochee, stressed, and unstressed. Understood? Okay, with this we move on to the next stanza of this poem. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind force manacles I hear. This stanza is the main center of the poem. It shows that the speaker sees London as a place where freedom and oppression are in conflict. It also moves the poem from focusing mainly on what is seen to what is heard. Just as every face showed signs of weakness and woe in the first stanza, here the speaker hears pain and suffering in every voice. The anaphora of in every, ये वाला, in every cry, in every cry, in every inference, in every voice. So ये वाला जो anaphora है, it highlights how widespread this suffering is, and it expands the poem's meaning to all of humanity. The speaker suggests that something is deeply wrong in every stage of life in this city, from birth to death. The capitalization of the man and infants, it emphasizes that everyone is affected. These words represent all people. Every sound they make reflects their suffering. People are born into misery, and this condition continues throughout their lives. The poem suggests that London creates a cycle of pain that repeats itself, trapping people from childhood to adulthood. The image of London as a cage in the first stanza is developed further here as a cycle of suffering that cannot be escaped. Then, if you see clearly, closely, you will find a seizure over here, okay, in line 7. So, it highlights a link between cries and every man. Cry of every man, cry of the infants, every voice, and then it is linking with every ban. It is suggesting that social restrictions are directly connected to people's suffering. The word ban implies that मतलब उस ban की वजह से people are crying. Okay, ना? So the ban implies that society limits and controls people, which leads to widespread misery, जिसकी वजह से देख रहा है The last line, the mind forged manacles I hear, it introduces the idea that these limits are actually forged in the mind. The manacles are not physical chains, but they are mental ones, and they are created by how people think about society and what is possible. Okay. The alliteration in mind forged manacles also connects back to man in line 5, suggesting that humans are responsible for their own suffering. The poem implies that people have forgotten how free and joyful life could be, and this failure of imagination is reflected in the oppressive nature of the city they themselves have created. With this, we move on to the next stanza. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So the third stanza works like a catalogue of misery and suffering. It provides clear examples that support the claim in the second stanza that London is trapped by mind-forged manacles. In a clever poetic technique, the last word of the previous stanza here is actually used to shape this stanza. देखो इसको clearly देखो. This is the last word of the previous stanza here. And if we look at these words, the first word of every verse in this stanza, it is the same, okay, na, as the last word. This is combining up to make the word here. Okay, so this is a clever poetic technique. कैसे ये the last word of the previous stanza here is used to shape this stanza. यानी कि this here is shaping up this stanza. Okay, so this stanza is an acrostic. Okay, this the third stanza is an acrostic where the first letters of each line spell here. This hidden imperative suggests a cry for attention and asks the reader to notice and respond to the suffering in London. सुनो मेरी बात सुनो. Okay, ना, this is acrostic. So lines 9 and 10 जो है, and the hapless soldier sigh runs in blood down Paris walls. Sorry, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church or falls. They describe specific forms of oppression in the city and hint at who is responsible. So chimney sweepers were workers, often children forced to clean chimneys. This shows economic oppression as children are made to work in dangerous conditions and lose their childhood. The poem suggests that people are born with the ability to live joyful, spiritual lives, but the adult world corrupts and damages them early. Line 10 continues the same sentence as line 9 through enjambment. ये enjambment आ गई यहाँ पे. Okay ना? Linking the suffering of chimney sweepers to the shame of blackening church authorities. Every blackening church appalls. Okay? तो इस चिमनी स्वीपर्स की ये जो हालत है ये किसकी वजह से है बिकॉज ऑफ द चर्च अथॉरिटीज सो द चर्च ऑफ इंग्लैंड हैड एन इम्पॉर्टेंट रोल इन सोसाइटी एट द टाइम especially in caring for the poor and vulnerable. However, the poem suggests it has failed in this duty. Instead of protecting people, it supports systems that restrict and harm them. Okay. Poverty also forced families to send children into dangerous work like chimney sweeping. So overall, the stanza criticizes society's failure to value and protect human life. The church, which should guide people morally and spiritually, is shown as ineffective and unable to prevent this suffering. With this, we move on to the last stanza, but nahin, the last two lines of this stanza. Okay, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So lines 11 and 12 continue the discussion of oppression from lines 9 and 10. Like the chimney sweeper, the soldier is also shown as a suffering figure. His oppression comes from palace, which is a metonymy. Metonymy. Metonymy क्या होती है? Metonymy. Okay, metonymy क्या होती है? Metonymy होती है when you take the name of one thing and by that name you suggest something else. For example, हम जब कहते हैं the White House has made this decision, तो उसका क्या मतलब होता है? The president of White House has made that decision. Okay, so इसी तरीके से palace is a metonymy for the authority of the state. ओके, स्पेशली द ब्रिटिश मोनार्की। तो जब हम कह रहे हैं कि रन्स इन ब्लड डाउन पैलेस वॉल्स, तो इधर पैलेस से क्या मुराद है? द ब्रिटिश मोनार्की। Because of harsh economic conditions in London, the soldier is forced to sell his service and risk his life in exchange for money. In this sense, he has to sacrifice his body to survive, similar to chimney sweepers and more directly prostitutes. Just as chimney sweepers cry out, soldiers also express their pain, but they sigh instead. The sibilance in hapless, which means unfortunate, soldiers sigh. It creates a soft breath like sound, making the emotion feel real and audible. However, the reason for this sigh is not completely clear. It could show frustration and exhaustion from harsh living conditions, or it could represent the soldier's final breath when he dies in battle, sent there by distant royal powers. Line 12 supports the second idea. The soldier's sigh is described as running down the palace walls in blood. This line also contains sibilance in words like runs, palace, and walls, which links the sound of sigh to the image of blood. So this suggests that the palace is responsible for the soldier's suffering and clearly represents the oppressive power of the state. The image of blood on the palace walls shows that the palace exists because of the soldiers' sacrifice. It is metaphorically built from their deaths. This creates strong criticism of war, suggesting that it wastes human life. Although the soldier is also involved in violence, the poem implies that this violence is part of a cycle created by society itself and by its mind forged manacles. Now, with this, we move on to the final stanza of this poem. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hers. So the final stanza brings the poem to a dark and hopeless conclusion. The speaker now describes what they hear at midnight in London. Midnight suggests the witching hour, a supernatural time which makes London's oppression feel like a kind of spell. This connects to the idea of mind forged manacles as a form of psychological control. The speaker hears the curse, which is another supernatural idea of youthful harlots. So these are young women who are forced into prostitution because of harsh living conditions. To survive, they must sell their bodies just like chimney sweepers and the soldiers. The focus on their youth strengthens the idea that London suffering is a cycle that traps people from birth to death. The cycle is made clearer with the mention of infants again. These children born to the youthful harlots enter a life of suffering from the very beginning. Even before they can understand the world, they are surrounded by pain. The assonance of the A sound in harlots, it blasts and infants links these ideas together and creates a loud, harsh effect like cries of pain. It shows that these infants have no escape from suffering. The poem ends with a powerful and dark image, which is the oxymoron. Marriage hearse. Hearse किसे कहते हैं? उस गाड़ी को which takes the funeral. So marriage तो is a beginning of a new life and hearse is the death. So marriage represents love, but here it is connected with death. It is shown by the hearse. So this suggests that in London, even love is destroyed by suffering. Relationships that should be full of care, like marriage or motherhood, are instead linked to death. The marriage urge is also affected by plagues caused by the youthful harlot's curse. This may refer to diseases, especially those linked to prostitution. The alliteration of blight and blast adds to the sense of violence and pain. The word plagues also reminds readers of the deadly diseases in London's history. Altogether, the stanza builds a heavy, suffocating feeling of suffering, suggesting that there is no escape unless society changes and frees itself from the mind forged manacles. With this, we move on to the themes. The first theme is the oppression of urban life. So, in London by William Blake, the speaker walks through the city and sees and hears only suffering. The people are marked by pain, okay, and everything. Um, Even the streets and the river is controlled and restricted. The poem suggests that this misery comes from mind forged manacles, meaning that the society itself, through its thinking and systems, has created this oppression. The city forces people like chimney sweepers, soldiers, and prostitutes to suffer and even sell their bodies just to survive. Blake presents London as a place where poverty and pain repeat in a cycle, affecting even newborn children. Overall, the poem criticizes modern urban life, especially during the Industrial Revolution, as harsh, inhuman, and deeply oppressive. The second theme is the corruption of childhood. In London by William Blake, Blake highlights how childhood innocence is destroyed by the harsh realities of city life. He believed children are naturally pure and joyful, but society corrupts them. The poem shows that children suffer from birth. Newborns are affected by their mother's misery, and infants cry in fear. The example of chimney sweepers shows how children are focused into dangerous work, losing their childhood just to survive. Overall, Blake suggests that the suffering of children is one of the clearest signs of how society's mind forged manacles corrupt and damage human life. With this, we move on to the alliteration, the literary devices that are present in this poem, the first one being alliteration. Alliteration occurs in all four stanzas of London. In lines 3 and 4, the numerous M and W sounds create a sense of abundant misery. Every person the speaker walks past shows marks of weakness and woe. The M is associated with these marks, and accordingly, the four appearances of M in these lines mirror the way the speaker encounters people on his walk. In line 8, the M sound appears again. Here, it helps give the phrase mind forged manacles its terrible power. The phrase refers to the oppressive restrictions that humanity places upon itself, which, in the speaker's view, are the result of collective failure to imagine a better society based on love and freedom. The M sound here picks up on the associations with misery established in the first stanza and also helps create a feeling of entrapment. The first word of the phrase starts with M, and so does the last, meaning that the phrase itself is in a way surrounded by M. It also echoes the M of man in line 5, strengthening the link between the manacles and human beings. The sonic similarity suggests that people are inherently prone to entrapping themselves, that these shackles aren't simply mind forged, but also man forged, because the oppression of the city life is something humanity has created for itself. In the third stanza, lines 10 and 12 alliterate through the words blackening and blood. Both have negative associations and both are associated with two of the sources of London's oppression, the official church and the state monarchy. The alliteration helps underline the way that society's authorities are directly responsible for people's pain and impoverishment. This is further reflected in the ch sound consonants of chimney and church. And just as the first two stanzas were linked by the M alliteration, the fourth stanza shares the BL sound with the third stanza. This time it is used for two verbs, both of which describe destruction, and blasts and blights. This helps create a sense that this destruction, like cities' oppression, is inescapable. Altogether, the repetition of sounds in the poem contributes to the sense that the misery of city life is cyclical and feeds upon itself. The next literary device happens to be anaphora. Anaphora is used in the second stanza. Lines 5, 6, and 7 all began with in every, and line 7 even repeats the phrase yet again after the caesura. So the anaphora of the second stanza also echoes the use of in every in line 3, which perhaps not technically anaphora, but it doesn't come at the beginning of a clause. Still, contributes to this increasingly dense repetition. Part of the poem's overall intention is to the way show the way that misery and pain are abundant in London everywhere. So they are everywhere that the speaker goes. The anaphora helps to emphasize this abundance. The repeated phrase creating a sense of accumulation and inescapability. जहाँ भी जाओगे, you cannot escape from it. उधर मिलेगा तुमको. It also links the various subjects together: man, infants, every voice, which presumably includes women as well, and every ban, that is, every rule or regulation of the city life. All of these are joined together by the poem's use of anaphora, which reveals that they are all a part of the same problem. Though the city of a man and the cry of an infant might seem to have very different causes, the speaker's point is that they ultimately have the same root cause: those mind forged manacles. It is these shackles, manacles, the symbol of psychological oppression that the speaker hears the echoing in every corner of London. With this, we move on to the literary device, which happens to be a new literary device for you, antoneclasses. So this is used in London. It is found in lines 3 and 4 when the first use of mark is a verb and the subsequent uses are nouns. The first mark means notice. The speaker notices weakness and woe in every phase that he or she comes across. Not only is the speaker actively marking the faces, but the faces themselves are actually marked by the weakness and woe. This might relate to their facial expressions or the way that their faces have changed over time through a life of pain and impoverishment. To mark something can also mean to leave a mark on it. In this sense, the antiglasses can also be understood as the speaker inscribing weakness and woe onto the people the speaker sees, not simply noticing but actively labeling their misery. This sets the speaker apart from these city inhabitants, suggesting that the speaker is not from the city or is from of a different, presumably higher class. The next literary device is assonance. Assonance occurs primarily in the final stanza of London. There is also a hint of assonance in the O sounds of does flow, but these are cut off in by an end stop, a way that helps introduce the idea of restriction and limitation that will come to characterize the poem. Across lines 14 and 15, harlots, blast, and infants are linked together by the A sound. They are literally linked together by sound within the poem too. The harlot screaming curse heralds a life of misery for the newborn infant. The curse blasts any chance the newborn would have had at living a free and joyful life. So the assonance then helps conjure an oppressed and violent atmosphere, underscoring the cyclical nature of misery in London and the impossibility of escaping. With this, we move on to the allusion. It is possible that the use of chartered is an allusion to Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. This book argued in favor of the principles of the French Revolution. In it, Paine makes a remark that quite possibly informs Blake's use of chartered here. Every chartered town, वो क्या remark है वो ये है, every chartered town is an aristocratical monopoly of itself. In other words, Paine is saying that the layout and organization of a city reflect its imbalance of power which is concentrated in the hands of a small ruling class. Of London specifically, Paine makes another remark echoed in this poem. It is a market where every man has his price and where corruption is common traffic. This line seems to echo the poem's suggestion that everyone in London, from chimney sweeps to prostitutes, has no choice but to sell themselves to survive. The next literary device is consonance. This occurs throughout the poem, but most heavily in the final stanza. As with alliteration and consonance, the consonance helps connect various concepts through similar sounds. Consonance is used in the stanza to make it sound even more violent and anguished than the previous stanzas. The lines use a T sound throughout, and this is a sound that requires the mouth to stop the airflow, mimicking the violent and threatening London atmosphere and suggesting a sense of impending suffocation. The T sound occurs in but most midnight streets, harlots, blasts, infants, tear, and plights. This literally makes the lines feel noisier, embodying the stanza's literal emphasis on the noises of the youthful harlots and the infants. The next literary device happens to be enjambment. Enjambment occurs between lines 3 and 4, 8 and 9, 9 and 10, 11 and 12, 12 and 13, and the entirety of the final stanza. The enjambment between lines 3 and 4 makes the use of marks at the start of the line 4 a more dramatic moment. The reader is expecting an unstretched syllable, but suddenly the marks of weakness impose themselves on the poem, mimicking this way they impose themselves on the speaker during this walk through London. Between lines 8 and 9, the poem actually enjambs across two stanzas. The key here is to look at the first letters of each line in the third stanza. They spell here, and in parallel, the last word of stanza 2 is here. So the poem issues its instruction to the reader and then literally spells out what can be heard in London environment. The two enjambments within the third stanza between lines 9 and 10 and lines 11 and 12 create a sense of balance between the stanza's two halves. In line 9 sets out an aspect of London's misery, the cries of chimney sweepers, and then enjambment allows line 10 to reveal one of the key causes of chimney sweepers' pain, the church. Likewise, line 12 reveals the soldier's pain is caused by the palace, which is a metonymic reference to the nation of a nation and monarchy. In the final stanza, the consistent enjambment builds a sense of propulsion as the poem heads towards its climax, but the lack of punctuation also helps the poem insist that London's misery is ongoing, with no end in sight. The refusal to punctuate means that the poem has no sense of closure, just as the Londoners have no escape from their hardships. Next literary device is diacope. Diacope occurs in the first stanza of London. Both lines 1 and 2 are dominated by the same single word, chartered. The word itself suggests a kind of administrative restriction placed on the city, its people, and even nature itself, as suggested by the river Thames. The repetition is entirely deliberate and it helps to create an atmosphere of enclosure and limitation. The speaker is trying to wander, but the way the streets are charted seems to dictate the speaker's course. Applying this same word to the river inverts the river as a symbol, whereas rivers often represent freedom. Here, the river only helps to emphasize the sense of oppression that runs throughout the poem. That is, no one is free in London. The restrictions that society has developed constrained even flowing bodies of water. Mars in line 4 can also be thought of as diacope, though we discuss what Blake is doing here, more specifically in our entry on end technical classes. In any case, its repetition seems to underscore just how incredibly common these various marks of misery are. The next literary device is sibilance. Sibilance is used most heavily in lines 11 and 12, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down the palace walls. Out of a total of 12 words in these two lines, six of them contain sibilance. The main effect that this achieves is to create the sound of sighing, which in itself is sibilant. The way in which the sibilance makes the lines themselves seem to sigh helps create an air of hopelessness and resignation. The poem feels as resigned as the soldiers seem to. Next literary device is metaphor. Metaphor appears twice in London. The first and the most important example in the phrase is mind forged manacles in line 8. Manacles are real metal chains used to restrain prisoners, but here they are not literal. Instead, they are metaphor for the way people in London are controlled and oppressed both socially and mentally. The poem suggests that society as a whole has failed to imagine a better and freer way of living. People have created systems and ideas that limit themselves and cause suffering. Those in power, such as the church in line 10 and the monarchs in line 12, help maintain and enforce these restrictions. The second metaphor appears in the final phrase, marriage years. This is not a real object but an imagined one. It combines the idea of marriage to which is love and union, with hers, which is death. This shows that even love in London is connected to death and suffering, highlighting how deeply misery affects every part of life in the city. The next literary device is metonymy. Metonymy occurs in London and is found in line 12. Here, the palace is not just talking about the specific building where the king lives, it is also a stand in for the entirety of the state, that is, the British monarchy. The reference helps pin a location and a cause to soldiers' misery. The monarchy, which gets to decide the fate of soldiers' lives, is responsible for the desperation they experience here. Next literary device is Caesura. Caesura appear only in line 4 and line 7. In line 4, the comma creates a short pause after the word weakness. This pause gives a feeling of tiredness or resignation as if the poem itself is already exhausted. Right after this pause comes marks of woe, which shows that any brief break is quickly followed by more suffering. The Caesura also replaces the word and, making it an example of ascendant and suggesting that the speaker is too tired to even add an extra word. The colon caesura in line 7 is very important. The lines before it describe how pain and misery are everywhere in London. The colon gathers all the suffering and then points to its cause. It connects the cries of people to every man, showing that their misery comes from restrictions placed on them. These limits are created by humans, especially those in power. The idea of mind force manacles explains that this suffering is caused by a shared failure to imagine a better society, and the seizure helps make this connection clear. Next literary device is oxymoron. Oxymoron occurs only once in London in its final two words. Here, the speaker clashes two very different worlds together: love, which is represented by marriage, and death, which is represented by the suggestion of a funeral hearse. It is a deeply unsettling image, and it is, in essence, arguing that there is no space for love to grow in oppressed urban environments like London. Any promise of love is already dead on arrival. Finally, with this, we move on to the form, meter, and rhyme scheme of this poem. As with many of Blake's poems, London has a simple form that furthers a discussion of complicated ideas. There are four quatrain stanzas. Okay, the first can be said to deal with the sights of London, while the following three focus instead on the sounds of the city. Of these, the only one with a particularly inventive form is stanza 3. Here, Blake takes the final word of stanza 2 and uses it to create an acrostic. The first letter of each line in stanza 3 spells out here, which helps the poem emphasize the sense of sound that the speaker experiences in London. But this formal feature is not immediately noticeable, which reflects the poem's idea that to truly understand the pain and impoverishment of London and cities like it takes a deliberate effort. Meter. On first glance, London is written in iambic tetrameter. Indeed, the first three lines conform to this scheme perfectly. I wandered through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow and mark in every face meet. ये सारे क्या हैं? Unstressed stress. सारे क्या हैं? Iambic. और कितने feet हैं इधर? 1 2 3 4. तो tetrameter. Okay. The poem here is setting up its basic premise, a walk through London, and the regularity of the meter calls to mind the speaker's solid and rhythmic walking pace. But suddenly, this regularity is thrown off by line 4 when the marks in people's faces appear in front of the speaker. Their weakness and woe disrupt the speaker's walking rhythm, and this change is reflected metrically through the shortened first look of the line. Marks of weakness, marks of woe. Okay, so this makes the appearance of the people's face more dramatic, as though they have literally just jumped unexpectedly in front of the speaker's eye. What's more, line 4 is in the only line to cut out the final syllable. Every line in stanza Three, breaks with iambic pentameter in the same way, which makes the chimney sweeper's cry and hapless soldier's sigh more prominent and audible. Rhyme scheme. London follows a simple rhyme scheme throughout, which is AB, AB. All of the rhymes are full, perfect rhymes as well. Generally speaking, the steady, unchanging rhyme scheme helps the poem feel like a walk, just like a pair of feet. One rhyme is laid down after another. It is also notable how many of these end words have negative connotations. Out of 16 ending words, perhaps only 5 sound neutral when taken out of context: street, flow, meet, man, and hair. All of the rest deal with pain, the sounds of pain, or images of restriction, and in the final word of the poem, here's death itself. This helps the poem create an overall atmosphere of misery and brings those other 5 words into the world of negative connotations. In context, street becomes the site of London's misery, and every person that the speaker meets is evidence of oppression and pain. Oppression and pain. The poem thus uses a relatively straightforward rhyme scheme to keep the focus on its thematic concerns, namely the oppression and misery of urban life. With this, we complete this analysis. I hope you understood it. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask.